The woman's hands trembled as she clutched her worn leather satchel, standing in the gilded lobby of the Grand Pacific Hotel in Seattle, Washington, while the clerk's cruel words echoed through the marble halls like a death sentence in 1883. Grace Lawson had traveled 3 grueling weeks by train and stagecoach from Philadelphia, her inheritance money carefully hidden in the lining of her coat, only to be told that no respectable establishment would rent a room to an unmarried woman traveling alone. The clerk's eyes had swept over her mud-stained traveling dress with undisguised contempt, his thin lips curling as he announced loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear that the Grand Pacific maintained certain standards, and she clearly did not meet them. Heat flooded Grace's cheeks as other guests turned to stare, their whispers cutting deeper than any blade. She had known this journey west would be difficult, but she had not anticipated the shame of being refused basic dignity simply because she lacked a husband or male escort. Her aunt had died 2 months prior, leaving Grace alone in the world with nothing but a modest inheritance and a dream of starting fresh in the untamed territories where a woman might build a life on her own terms. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice, "I can pay in advance. I have money." The clerk sniffed dismissively. "Our policy is quite clear, miss. Perhaps you should have considered more appropriate arrangements before embarking on such an unseemly journey." Grace felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned toward the door, her vision blurring slightly as exhaustion and humiliation warred within her chest. She had nowhere to go, no contacts in this rough frontier city, and night was falling fast over the Seattle streets. That was when she heard the voice, deep as rolling thunder and edged with barely contained anger. "That's a damn shame, treating a lady like common trash." Grace turned to find the source of that rumbling bass and nearly gasped. The man who stepped forward from the shadows near the fireplace was unlike anyone she had ever seen in Philadelphia's refined parlors. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the light from the windows behind him. His buckskin jacket stretched tight across a chest layered with solid muscle, and his arms looked strong enough to snap a man in half. Dark hair fell past his collar in thick waves, and several days' worth of beard shadowed a jaw that could have been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her, pale blue and intense, filled with a protective fury that made her heart skip. The clerk's face paled. "Mr. Thornton, this is a private matter between the hotel and this woman. It does not concern you." The mountain man called Thornton took another step forward, and Grace noticed every other person in the lobby seemed to shrink back instinctively. He radiated danger the way a wolf radiated predatory grace, all coiled power and barely leashed violence. His hand rested casually on the knife sheathed at his belt, fingers drumming a subtle thread against the worn leather. Samuel Thornton," he said, not looking away from the clerk, "and I'm making it my concern, Henderson. This woman's traveled a long way, and she needs a place to rest. You're going to give her a room." Henderson's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Mr. Thornton, I cannot simply disregard hotel policy because you—" "How much?" Samuel pulled a leather pouch from inside his jacket, the coins within clinking heavily. "How much for your finest room for a week?" "That's not the issue. The issue is propriety and—" Samuel slammed the pouch on the marble counter with enough force to make everyone in the lobby jump. "I said how much." The clerk named Henderson licked his lips nervously, his eyes darting between Samuel's granite expression and the money bag. $40 for the week, but as I explained, we cannot accommodate single women without proper, here's 60. Samuel counted out the coins with deliberate precision, each one ringing against the marble like a judge's gavel. "The extra 20 is for you to remember your manners next time a lady walks through that door." Grace found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "You don't have to do this. I'll find somewhere else." Samuel turned those piercing blue eyes on her, and Grace felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, the hard edges of his anger gentling into something that looked almost like concern. "There isn't anywhere else, madam," he said quietly. "Not for a woman alone. Not in this town after dark. And I'll be damned if I stand by and watch you wander the streets when I can do something about it." Henderson's hand hovered over the money, greed warring with stubbornness across his pinched features. Finally, he snatched up the coins and pulled out the registration book with visible reluctance. Fine. But she'll need to sign the register, and any complaints from other guests will result in immediate removal. Won't be any complaints, Samuel said, his voice carrying a clear warning. Will there? Henderson shook his head quickly, his fingers fumbling with the pen. Grace stepped forward on shaking legs and signed her name in the register with as much dignity as she could muster. Her hand brushed Samuel's as she set down the pen, and she felt calluses thick as armor plating, the hands of a man who carved his living from the wilderness itself. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his eyes again. "I don't know how I can repay such kindness." Something flickered across Samuel's rugged features, an emotion too quick to name. "No repayment needed, Miss Lawson." He had read her name from the register. "Just wanted to see right done." Henderson snapped his fingers at a young porter. "Show Miss Lawson to room 23, second floor facing the street." The disdain in his voice suggested this was one of the hotel's lesser rooms, but Grace did not care. She had a bed for the night and shelter from the cold September rain that had begun to patter against the windows. As she turned to follow the porter, Samuel spoke again. "Miss Lawson, might I have a word before you retire?" Grace hesitated. Every rule of proper behavior she had been taught screaming that she should decline, should hurry away from this dangerous stranger no matter how much he had just helped her. But propriety had not kept a roof over her head tonight. This mountain man had done what all of polite society had refused to do. "Of course, Mr. Thornton." Samuel guided her to a quiet corner of the lobby, far from Henderson's watchful glare and the curious stares of other guests. Up close, Grace could see the small scars that marked his hands and the side of his neck, the badges of a hard life lived in the mountains. He smelled of pine and wood smoke and leather, as if he had brought the wilderness itself into this civilized space. "I don't mean to speak out of turn," Samuel began, his voice low and earnest. "But Seattle's a rough town for anyone, and rougher still for a woman on her own. Whatever brought you out here, I hope you've got plans, people expecting you." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I came to start over. My aunt passed, and there was nothing left for me in Philadelphia. I thought perhaps I might find teaching work or employment in one of the shops." Samuel's expression darkened. "You saw how Henderson treated you just now. That's going to be most folks' reaction to a single woman trying to make her way alone. They'll either try to take advantage or refuse you outright." "Then what would you suggest I do?" Grace heard the frustration bleeding into her words. "Return to Philadelphia with my tail between my legs? Marry the first man who asks just to have protection? I came here because I heard the West was a place where people could build new lives, where the old rules did not matter so much." "The old rules matter plenty," Samuel said, but his tone was not unkind. "Just in different ways. But I understand wanting a fresh start. I came out here for the same reason 8 years ago." Rain drummed harder against the windows, and Grace shivered despite the warmth of the lobby. Samuel noticed immediately, shrugging out of his buckskin jacket and draping it over her shoulders before she could protest. The garment swallowed her, heavy and warm and smelling of him. "Keep it tonight," he said. "I've got more layers than I need." Grace clutched the jacket around her shoulders, feeling the rough texture of the buckskin against her fingers. No man had ever offered her such casual, unthinking kindness. "You've already done so much. I don't understand why you're helping me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "My sister traveled west 5 years ago to join me. Her stagecoach was attacked outside Portland. She died before I could reach her." His jaw tightened, old grief and anger mixing in his expression. "Ever since then, I can't abide seeing a woman in trouble and doing nothing about it. Maybe that makes me a fool, but it's the truth." Grace's heart clenched with sudden understanding. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "It was a long time ago," Samuel said, though his eyes suggested the wound remained fresh. "But it taught me that the West can be cruel to those without protection. So I'm going to make you an offer, Miss Lawson, and I want you to hear me out before you answer." Grace waited, her pulse quickening with a mixture of apprehension and something else she could not quite name. "Stay here tonight. Get some rest," Samuel continued. "Tomorrow morning, if you still want to try your luck in Seattle, I'll help you find respectable lodgings and put you in touch with some folks who might have work. But if you find that this city's not what you hoped, I've got a cabin up in the mountains about 2 hours' ride from here. It's small but solid, and there's plenty of room. You could stay there while you figure out your next move. No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to catch your breath. Grace stared at him, trying to reconcile this offer with everything she knew about the world. Accepting such an invitation would be scandalous beyond measure, the kind of thing that would have had Philadelphia society clutching their pearls and fainting onto their settees. But Philadelphia society had also left her alone and vulnerable, clinging to rules that served men far better than women. "Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger?" she asked carefully. "What would you expect in return?" Samuel met her gaze steadily, no calculation or hidden agenda in those blue eyes. "Nothing beyond maybe some cooking and cleaning to earn your keep if you felt so inclined. I've lived alone too long and could use the company, but I'd not force anything on you. You'd have your own space, and my word as a man that you'd be safe under my roof." "People would talk," Grace said, though even as she spoke, she recognized the weakness of the objection. People were already talking, had been talking since the moment Henderson had denied her service so publicly. "People always talk," Samuel replied. "Out in the mountains, there's nobody around to hear them. You'd have time and space to think, to plan properly instead of rushing into something because you're desperate." Grace felt exhaustion pulling at her bones, the weight of 3 weeks' travel and the emotional battering of the day finally catching up with her. The sensible choice would be to thank this mountain man and retreat to her room, to maintain the boundaries that proper society demanded. But sense had not gotten her very far today. "Let me sleep on it," she heard herself say. "Ask me again in the morning, when I've had time to think clearly." Samuel nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's fair. I'll be taking breakfast at the restaurant across the street at 7. If you want to talk more, join me. If not, no hard feelings." He turned to leave, and Grace realized she still wore his jacket. She started to shrug it off, but he waved her off. "Keep it tonight," he said again. "I'll get it back tomorrow if we meet, or I'll collect it from Henderson before I leave town." Grace watched him walk away, his powerful frame moving with surprising grace through the lobby and out into the rainy street. She stood there for a long moment, clutching his jacket around her shoulders and wondering what she had gotten herself into. The porter cleared his throat politely, and Grace followed him up the stairs to her room. It was small and sparse, as Henderson's spiteful tone had suggested, but it had a bed with clean linens and a window that looked out over Seattle's muddy streets. Grace set her satchel on the narrow dresser and sank onto the bed, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She lay back still wearing Samuel's jacket, too exhausted to remove it, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Tomorrow she would have to make a decision that could change everything. Stay in Seattle and fight for every scrap of independence in a city that had already shown its hostility, or take a leap of faith and trust a stranger who had shown her more kindness in one evening than society had shown her in years. Sleep claimed her before she could settle on an answer. Grace woke to pale morning sunlight filtering through her window and the distant sounds of Seattle coming to life below. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why she felt so warm. Then she remembered Samuel's jacket still wrapped around her, and everything came flooding back. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the journey and the thin mattress. The room looked even more dismal in daylight, with peeling wallpaper and a crack running through the wash basin. Grace poured water from the pitcher and washed her face, studying her reflection in the spotted mirror above the dresser. She looked tired, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and her auburn hair escaping in wild curls from yesterday's pins. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn chin, though both parents had been dead for over a decade. Aunt Margaret had raised her with strict attention to propriety and decorum, preparing Grace for a life as some merchant's wife in Philadelphia's middling social circles. But Aunt Margaret was gone now, and Grace's teaching position at the Girls' Academy had evaporated when the headmistress had discovered Grace's family's financial troubles. Apparently, poverty was contagious in polite society, something to be quarantined and avoided. Grace had spent her last dollars on the journey west, gambling everything on the hope that distance might equal freedom. She changed into her least wrinkled dress, a simple green cotton that brought out her eyes, and did her best to tame her hair into a respectable bun. She folded Samuel's jacket carefully and draped it over her arm, then made her way downstairs. The morning clerk was different from Henderson, a younger man who barely glanced at her as she passed through the lobby. Grace stepped out into the Seattle morning, breathing in the scent of rain-washed air mixed with wood smoke and the tang of the sea. The restaurant Samuel had mentioned was easy to spot across the muddy street, a simple establishment with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Grace hesitated on the boardwalk, her heart pounding. She could still turn back, could spend the day searching Seattle for respectable employment and lodging. But even as she considered it, she remembered Henderson's contempt, the way he had treated her as something less than human simply because she lacked a man's protection. She crossed the street and entered the restaurant. Samuel sat at a table near the back, his large frame making the simple wooden chair look like child's furniture. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his dark hair still damp and his beard trimmed shorter. He wore a clean flannel shirt that somehow made his shoulders look even broader, the fabric stretched tight across his muscled chest and arms. When he saw her, his face lit with a smile that transformed his rugged features entirely. "Miss Lawson," he said, standing immediately, "I was not sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," Grace admitted, approaching the table. "But I find myself curious about your offer, Mr. Thornton." "Samuel, please. I think we're past formalities after yesterday." He pulled out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy that sat oddly with his rough appearance. "Have you eaten? The breakfast here's simple but good." Grace realized she was starving, having eaten nothing since yesterday afternoon. "That sounds wonderful." Samuel signaled the waitress, a plump woman with kind eyes who took their order without the judgment Grace had come to expect. Soon they had plates of eggs and bacon, thick slices of bread with butter, and coffee so strong Grace could feel it waking every cell in her body. "Tell me about this cabin of yours," Grace said between bites, watching Samuel carefully. In the morning light, she could see more details about him. Small scars marked his hands and forearms, and a longer scar ran along his left cheek, barely visible beneath his beard. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and clear, and surprisingly gentle for a man who radiated such physical power. "Built it myself 6 years ago," Samuel said, warming to the topic. "It's in the foothills about 12 miles east of here, near a creek with good fishing. 2 rooms plus a loft, stone fireplace, solid roof that doesn't leak. I've got a garden plot, some chickens, and I do some trapping and trading to cover what I cannot grow or make myself. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable and safe." "Do you not get lonely?" Grace asked. "Living alone so far from town?" Samuel considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. But I prefer the mountains to crowds of people. Out there things make sense. You work hard, you survive. You prepare for winter, you stay warm. There's an honesty to it that I never found in cities." He paused, then added, "Though I'll admit, coming into Seattle yesterday and seeing Henderson treat you that way reminded me why I spend so much time alone. People can be cruel for no good reason." Grace felt warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. "You said your sister was coming to join you when she died. Had she been planning to live at the cabin?" Pain flickered across Samuel's face. "Yes. She was going to stay with me until she got her bearings, maybe find work in one of the smaller towns nearby. Sarah was smart, good with numbers. I thought she might find bookkeeping work or something similar." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I should have gone to Portland to escort her myself instead of letting her travel with strangers. That mistake haunts me still." Grace reached across the table without thinking, placing her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough, and she felt him start at the contact before his hand relaxed beneath hers. "You cannot blame yourself for what happened," she said softly. "Sometimes the world is simply cruel, regardless of what precautions we take." Samuel turned his hand over, gently squeezing her fingers. "Maybe, but it taught me to act when I see someone in need, rather than assuming someone else will help. That's why I spoke up yesterday." They sat like that for a moment, hands joined across the table in a way that should have felt scandalous, but instead felt natural and right. Grace had never been touched so gently by a man, had never felt this strange pull toward someone she barely knew. She drew her hand back reluctantly. "If I were to accept your offer, what would the arrangement look like? I need to understand what I'd be agreeing to." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "I'd take you up to the cabin today if you're willing. You'd have the loft to yourself. That's your private space. Downstairs is the main room with the fireplace and kitchen area, plus my room. You can lock your door at night if it makes you feel safer. As for daily life, I'm usually up at dawn checking traps or tending the animals. I'd appreciate help with meals and keeping the place clean, but I'm not going to stand over you demanding service. We'd both just be living our lives under the same roof. And if I decided to leave, Grace asked, if I found the isolation too much or wanted to return to Seattle, then I'd bring you back to town myself. No questions asked, Samuel said immediately. I'm offering shelter, not a prison. Stay as long as it helps you. Leave whenever you want. Though I'd hope you'd give me warning rather than disappearing in the night. Grace smiled slightly. That seems fair. She took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into unknown waters. All right, I'll come to your cabin, at least for a little while. But I want to be clear that this is a practical arrangement, not anything else. Samuel nodded gravely, though something in his eyes suggested he found her stipulation amusing. Understood, Miss Lawson, purely practical. Grace, she corrected. If we're going to be living under the same roof, you should call me Grace. Grace, Samuel repeated, and the way he said her name sent shivers down her spine. That's a good name. Suits you. They finished their breakfast while making practical plans. Samuel needed to purchase some supplies before they left town, and Grace wanted to settle her bill with the hotel despite his earlier payment. Samuel tried to argue, but Grace insisted. She might be accepting his help, but she would not be entirely dependent on his charity. By mid-morning, they were ready to leave. Samuel had a powerful dapple-gray horse waiting at the livery stable, along with a pack mule loaded with supplies. Grace eyed the horse nervously. She had ridden a few times as a child, but never felt entirely comfortable on horseback. Samuel read her hesitation immediately. You'll ride with me, he said, swinging up into the saddle with easy grace despite his size. It'll be more comfortable than the mule, and safer on the mountain trails. He reached down, and Grace took his hand, gasping as he lifted her effortlessly up behind him. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and even through his shirt she could feel the solid muscle of his torso. Heat flooded her face as her body pressed against his back. Hold tight, Samuel said, and Grace felt the rumble of his voice through her arms. It's a bit of a climb. They rode out of Seattle as the morning sun burned off the last of the fog. The city gave way to dense forests of pine and fir, the trail climbing steadily into the foothills. Grace clung to Samuel, acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies. She should have felt afraid, or at least apprehensive, riding into the wilderness with a man she barely knew. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. Samuel pointed out landmarks as they rode, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the horse's hooves. He showed her where to find wild berries in summer, which trees attracted the best game, where the creek ran clear enough to drink from safely. He spoke about the land with obvious love, his descriptions painting pictures of seasons Grace had not yet seen. They stopped once to rest the animals and eat a quick lunch of bread and cheese. Grace stretched her stiff legs while Samuel checked the mule's load, and she found herself watching him work with fascination. Every movement was efficient and purposeful, the actions of someone who had learned to survive through careful attention to detail. His muscles flexed beneath his shirt as he adjusted the ropes, and Grace felt a strange warmth low in her belly that she tried very hard to ignore. Not much farther now, Samuel said, catching her watching him. Another hour or so. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. When they mounted again, she settled against his back with less self-consciousness, allowing herself to relax into the rhythm of the horse's gait. True to his word, they reached the cabin just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Grace's first glimpse of Samuel's home made her breath catch. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, built of sturdy logs chinked with clay. A stone chimney rose from one end, and Grace could see glass windows, an unexpected luxury. A small barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and a tidy garden plot still showing the last of the summer vegetables. It's beautiful, Grace said honestly, as Samuel helped her down from the horse. It looks like something from a storybook. Samuel's face flushed with obvious pleasure at the compliment. Took me 2 years to build it the way I wanted. Come on, I'll show you inside. He opened the door, and Grace stepped into a space that immediately felt like a home. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, with a simple kitchen area along one wall and a rough-hewn table with benches. Samuel's bedroom door stood open, showing a neatly made bed and little else. A ladder led up to the loft space, which Grace could see had a small window and enough room for a bed and chest. "It's not much," Samuel said, sounding almost apologetic, "but it's warm and dry." "It's wonderful," Grace said, and meant it. The cabin had a cozy feel that the Grand Pacific Hotel's gilded opulence had lacked. This was a space built with care, every detail considered and crafted. "Thank you for bringing me here," Samuel smiled, the expression lighting his whole face. "Let me get your things settled upstairs. Then I need to tend the animals before dark. Make yourself at home." He carried her satchel up the ladder with ease, and Grace heard him moving around in the loft. She explored the main room, noting the shelves lined with books, the pelts hanging on the walls, the carved wooden cup sitting on the mantel. Samuel came back down and headed outside, and Grace followed to watch him care for the horse and mule. He worked with quiet competence, brushing down the animals and checking their hooves, hauling water from the nearby creek and distributing grain from the barn. The chickens came running when he appeared, clucking and fussing around his boots. He scattered feed for them while checking for eggs, emerging from the coop with several in a basket. "Fresh eggs for breakfast," he said, handing her the basket. "I'll get a fire going and we can have dinner." Grace found herself falling into an easy rhythm with him. While Samuel built up the fire and prepared the hearth for cooking, Grace explored the kitchen supplies and found what she needed to make a simple stew from dried meat and vegetables. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other in the small space with surprising coordination. As darkness fell outside, they sat at the table and ate the stew with thick slices of bread. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the log walls. Grace could not remember the last time she had felt so comfortable, so at ease in someone's presence. "This is good," Samuel said, sopping up the last of his stew with bread. "Better than anything I've made in months." "It's simple enough," Grace demurred, though she felt pleased by the compliment. "You had all the ingredients ready." "Still tastes better when someone else makes it." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her in the firelight. "Can I ask what you're running from, Grace? You don't have to answer if you'd rather not, but I get the sense there's more to your story than just wanting a fresh start." Grace considered deflecting, then decided she owed him honesty given how much he had already done for her. "I told you my aunt died. What I didn't mention was that she left debts I didn't know about. Creditors came calling, demanding payment I couldn't provide. The academy where I taught dismissed me, and my friends suddenly remembered previous engagements whenever I tried to call on them. I realized I had nothing holding me in Philadelphia except memories, most of them painful. So I took what little money remained and came west." "That must have taken courage," Samuel said quietly, "leaving everything you knew behind." "Or desperation," Grace replied with a bitter laugh. "I'm not sure there's much difference sometimes." "There's a difference," Samuel insisted. "Desperate people make reckless choices. You planned, you saved, you came to a city with opportunities. That's courage, not desperation." Grace felt tears prickling her eyes, overwhelmed by his faith in her when her own had been shaken so badly. "I felt so foolish when Henderson refused me service, like I had made a terrible mistake coming here at all." "Henderson's a small man with a small mind," Samuel said, his voice hardening slightly. "He treats people badly because it makes him feel important. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." "But he was right about one thing," Grace said softly. "The world is harder for women alone. I can't just build a cabin in the mountains and live independently like you do. Society won't allow it." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting his features into sharp relief. Maybe society's rules need changing. Maybe the whole system that says a woman can't make her own way is rotten and needs tearing down. Grace stared at him in surprise. "That's a radical thing to say." "I've watched good women suffer because some man failed them," Samuel said bluntly. "My mother died young because my father drank away every penny we had, and she had no way to leave him. Sarah came west because the man she was engaged to beat her and her only escape was running. I've seen too much to think the current system works for anyone except powerful men." "Your father," Grace said carefully. "Is that why you came to the mountains, to get away from him?" He died in a bar fight when I was 17, Samuel said flatly. I came west because I was tired of being angry all the time, tired of wanting to hit something. Out here, I could put that energy into building instead of destroying. He met her eyes. I'm not that angry boy anymore, Grace. I want you to know that. Whatever demons I had, I've made peace with them. I'm not afraid of you, Grace said honestly. I probably should be, riding off into the wilderness with a stranger. But I'm not. Good, Samuel said, and his expression softened. Because I'd never hurt you. I swear that on whatever you hold sacred. They cleaned up the dinner dishes together, and Grace found herself yawning as exhaustion finally caught up with her. Samuel noticed immediately. You should get some rest, he said. It's been a long couple of days for you. I'll bank the fire and make sure everything's secure. Grace climbed the ladder to the loft, her muscles protesting after the long ride. The space was small but cozy, with a real bed covered in quilts and furs. A small chest sat against one wall, and the window looked out over the moonlit clearing. She could hear Samuel moving around below, the comforting sounds of someone caring for their home. She changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers, sinking into the surprising comfort of the mattress. Below, she heard Samuel enter his room and close the door softly. The cabin settled into nighttime quiet, with only the gentle sounds of the forest outside and the occasional pop from the banked fire. Grace lay awake for a while, processing everything that had happened in the past 2 days. By all conventional wisdom, she had made a terrible mistake, possibly a dangerous one. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, with no way to call for help if things went wrong. But somehow, none of that felt true. Samuel had shown her more respect and kindness than any of the supposedly civilized men she had known in Philadelphia. He had offered her shelter and safety without demanding anything in return beyond some basic household help. And more than that, she felt something stirring in her chest when she looked at him, something warm and electric that scared her even as it thrilled her. She was 23 years old, had spent her whole life following rules that had ultimately failed her. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start living. With that thought, Grace finally drifted off to sleep. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Grace woke each morning to find Samuel already up and working, either checking his trap lines or tending the animals. She would make breakfast, and they would eat together while planning the day's tasks. Then, Samuel would head out to hunt or work on various maintenance projects around the cabin, while Grace tackled household chores or worked in the garden. Grace discovered she enjoyed the physical labor in a way she never had in Philadelphia. There was satisfaction in baking bread from scratch, in preserving the last of the summer vegetables for winter, in gathering eggs from the chickens who had stopped fleeing from her approach. Her hands grew rougher, her arms stronger, and she felt healthier than she had in years. Samuel proved to be an easy companion. He did not talk much, but when he did, his observations were thoughtful and often surprisingly funny. He taught her practical skills like how to split kindling properly and which plants in the forest were safe to eat. He never stood too close or touched her inappropriately, but Grace found herself noticing the brush of his hand when he passed her something, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking. She was noticing a lot of things about Samuel. The way his muscles flexed when he chopped wood, the shirt stretching across his broad back with each swing of the axe, the rare smiles that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish, the gentleness with which he handled the animals, the patience he showed when teaching her new skills. He was nothing like the polished gentleman she had known in Philadelphia, and Grace found herself grateful for that. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into her stay, Grace was gathering herbs near the edge of the clearing when she heard shouting from the direction of the cabin. She hurried back to find Samuel standing tense and alert, his hand on his knife, facing 3 rough-looking men on horseback. "I told you I don't have any furs to trade yet," Samuel was saying, his voice hard. "Come back in a month and we can talk business." The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a scarred face, leaned forward in his saddle. "That's not very neighborly, Thornton. We rode all this way just to see you." "You rode all this way to cause trouble," Samuel corrected. "Best you ride back before someone gets hurt." Grace froze at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding. The tension in the air was palpable, violence barely held at bay. One of the other riders noticed her and grinned, revealing broken teeth. "Who's the woman, Thornton? Didn't know you had yourself a wife." "She's none of your concern," Samuel said flatly. "Grace, go inside." But Grace found herself walking forward instead, driven by some instinct she did not fully understand. "Gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her fear, "I'm sure there's no need for hostility. As my husband said, if you come back in a few weeks, I'm certain we can do business with you." She emphasized the word husband, placing herself firmly under Samuel's protection. The three men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Samuel's hand relaxed slightly from his knife, though his body remained coiled and ready. "Well then," the scarred man said slowly, "congratulations on your marriage, Thornton. Funny we didn't hear about it." "We keep to ourselves," Samuel replied. "Now, unless you've got other business, I'd appreciate you moving along. My wife and I have work to do." The men clearly wanted to push further, but something in Samuel's stance discouraged them. The lead rider finally jerked his head, and the three of them turned their horses and rode back down the trail. Samuel watched until they disappeared from view, his body still tense as a drawn bowstring. Then he turned to Grace, and she saw fury warring with concern in his pale eyes. "That was foolish," he said tightly. "Those men are dangerous. You should have stayed back." "They were going to attack you," Grace said, her own fear finally catching up with her. She felt her hands start to shake. "I could see it in their faces. I thought if they believed we were married, they might leave." Samuel's expression softened as he noticed her trembling. "Come here," he said gently, and before Grace could process what was happening, she was wrapped in his arms, pressed against his broad chest. She could feel his heart pounding almost as hard as her own. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "They're gone. You're safe." Grace clutched his shirt, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and leather. She had never been held like this, with such gentle strength, as if she were something precious that needed protecting. It felt right in a way that terrified her. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Claimed jumpers and thieves," Samuel said, his voice rumbling through her. "They've been causing trouble in these mountains for a couple years now. I've had run-ins with them before, but they usually leave me alone since I've got nothing worth stealing. Today was different because of you." Grace pulled back enough to look up at him. "Because of me?" Samuel's jaw tightened. They saw an opportunity. A woman alone up here with one man for protection. They were thinking about what they could take from me, and you were part of that calculation. Horror washed through Grace. "I've put you in danger." "No," Samuel said firmly, his hands moving to cup her face. "Don't think that for a second. Those men are the problem, not you. And your quick thinking with the marriage claim probably saved us from bloodshed today." Grace realized how close they were standing, how his calloused thumbs were gently stroking her cheeks. Her heart was racing for entirely different reasons now. "Samuel," she whispered. "Grace," he breathed back, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Grace found herself leaning into him instead, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as the kiss deepened. Samuel made a low sound in his throat, one arm wrapping around her waist to pull her closer, while his other hand tangled in her hair. Grace had been kissed before, chased pecks from suitors in Philadelphia's parlors. This was nothing like those cold, proper touches. This was fire and heat and hunger, Samuel's mouth moving against hers with barely restrained passion. She felt alive in a way she never had before, every nerve ending singing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "That was improper. I shouldn't have taken advantage." "You didn't," Grace said quickly. "I wanted you to kiss me. I've wanted it for a while now." Samuel pulled back enough to search her face. "Grace, I don't want you to feel obligated because of the situation. You're here under my protection, and I won't abuse that trust." "Is this about trust?" Grace asked, her heart still racing. "Or about what we both feel?" "Both," Samuel admitted. "I care about you, Grace, more than I should after such a short time. But I know how precarious your position is. I won't make it more complicated by pushing for something you might not want." Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "What if I do want it? What if I want more than just shelter and protection? Samuel's eyes darkened with an emotion that made Grace's stomach flutter. Then we should talk about what that means, because if we go down this road, I'm not interested in something temporary. I don't do anything halfway, Grace. If you give yourself to me, I'm going to want to keep you. The intensity of his words should have frightened her. Instead, Grace felt a thrill of excitement mixed with certainty. I think I'd like to be kept, she said softly. Samuel's expression shifted into something fierce and possessive. You're sure? Because once I claim you properly, I'm not letting go. I'm sure, Grace said, and realized she meant it completely. I've spent my whole life being careful, following rules, doing what I was told. Where did it get me? Alone and desperate in a city that wanted nothing to do with me. You've shown me more care in a few weeks than anyone has in years. If that's not worth taking a risk for, I don't know what is. Samuel kissed her again, harder this time, a kiss full of promise and possession. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. Then we do this properly. We ride into Seattle tomorrow and find a preacher. I'm not going to have you under a cloud of scandal, not when I can make you my wife legally. Tomorrow? Grace felt dizzy with the speed of it all. Unless you want to wait, Samuel said, though his arms tightened around her as if the thought of letting her go was physically painful. But I'm not courting you for months when we both know what we want. Life's too short and too uncertain for that. Grace thought about the past weeks, the easy companionship and growing attraction, the way she had come to crave Samuel's rare smiles and rumbling laugh. She thought about how safe she felt in his arms, how right this all seemed despite its impropriety. Tomorrow, she agreed. Let's do it tomorrow. Samuel's whoop of joy echoed through the clearing, and then he was spinning her around, her feet leaving the ground entirely as he held her against his chest. Grace laughed, clutching his shoulders, feeling lighter than she had in years. They rode into Seattle the next morning before dawn, Grace once again seated behind Samuel on the big gray horse. This time, her arms around his waist felt different, charged with anticipation and the memory of last night's kisses. They had spent the evening sitting by the fire, talking about their hopes and fears, planning a future that had seemed impossible just days ago. Samuel had been honest about the challenges. Mountain winters were harsh, and Grace would be isolated for months at a time. His income from trapping was modest, and luxuries would be few. But he promised to care for her, to keep her safe, to build a good life together with his own two hands. Grace had not cared about the difficulties. She had lived in Philadelphia's relative comfort and been miserable. The prospect of hardship with Samuel seemed infinitely preferable to security without him. They reached Seattle as the sun was climbing above the eastern mountains. Samuel led them directly to a small church on the edge of town, where a kindly minister agreed to perform the ceremony. Samuel paid the man with coins from his leather pouch, then turned to Grace with sudden uncertainty. I should have gotten you a ring, he said, looking distressed. There wasn't time, but you deserve better than this rushed ceremony. Grace took his hands in hers. I don't need a ring or a fancy ceremony. I just need you. The minister cleared his throat. Shall we begin? The ceremony was simple and brief, the words ancient and binding. Samuel's voice was steady as he made his vows, his pale eyes locked on Grace's face with an intensity that stole her breath. When it was her turn, Grace promised to love and honor him, meaning every word with a fierceness that surprised her. You may kiss your bride, the minister said with a warm smile. Samuel cupped Grace's face with both hands and kissed her tenderly, a kiss full of promise and devotion. Grace felt tears prickling her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just done. 24 hours ago, she had been Samuel's guest. Now, she was his wife. They signed the marriage certificate, the minister witnessed it, and suddenly it was official. Grace Lawson was now Grace Thornton, wife of a mountain man, living a life she could never have imagined a month ago. Samuel insisted on stopping at the general store before heading back to the cabin. He bought Grace a simple gold band that he slipped onto her finger with obvious satisfaction, along with supplies for a celebratory dinner. The clerk congratulated them politely, showing none of Henderson's earlier contempt now that Grace wore a wedding ring and had a husband at her side. They rode back into the mountains with the sun climbing higher, the ring on Grace's finger catching the light. She felt different somehow, marked and claimed in a way that should have chafed, but instead felt comforting. She belonged now to Samuel, and to this wild place, and the freedom of it was intoxicating. When they reached the cabin, Samuel dismounted and lifted Grace down with his hands on her waist, but instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the door. "What are you doing?" Grace laughed, clutching his shoulders. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," Samuel said, his eyes dancing with rare humor. "It's traditional." He kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her down gently in front of the fireplace. The cabin looked the same as when they had left it, but everything felt different. This was their home now, not just Samuel's cabin where Grace was staying. "I'll tend the animals," Samuel said, his voice suddenly rough. "Give you time to settle your thoughts." Grace caught his arm as he turned away. "My thoughts are settled, Samuel. I married you because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. I don't need time to adjust to that." Samuel searched her face, clearly looking for any sign of doubt or fear. Whatever he saw, there seemed to satisfy him, because his expression shifted into something hungry and possessive. "Tonight," he said, the single word a promise. "Tonight you're truly mine." Heat flooded through Grace at his words and the intensity in his eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him head outside to care for the horse and mule. The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of normal activity and heightened awareness. They worked together as they had for weeks, but now every glance felt charged, every accidental touch electric. Grace prepared dinner with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware of Samuel's presence as he moved around the cabin. As darkness fell and they ate the special meal Grace had prepared, Samuel kept watching her with that intense gaze that made her stomach flutter. Finally, he set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," Grace admitted. That is, I don't know exactly." Understanding softened Samuel's expression. "We'll go slow. I'm not going to rush you or do anything you're not ready for. Just tell me if you want to stop." Grace stood, her heart pounding, and moved around the table to stand before him. Samuel looked up at her, his expression questioning, and Grace took his face in her hands the way he had held hers earlier. "I don't want to stop," she said firmly. "I want everything, Samuel. I want to be your wife in truth." Samuel rose from his chair in one fluid motion, gathering her into his arms. "Then you will be," he murmured against her lips. "By morning, there won't be any doubt that you're mine." He kissed her deeply, thoroughly, his strong arms lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, giving herself over to the kiss and the feel of his solid body against hers. Samuel carried her to his bedroom, kicking the door closed behind them, and Grace felt the last of her doubts evaporate. This was where she was meant to be, with this man, in this place, building a life that belonged to them alone. Morning found Grace wrapped in Samuel's arms, her head resting on his broad chest as pale sunlight filtered through the bedroom window. Every muscle in her body felt pleasantly sore, and she was acutely aware of her nakedness pressed against his. Samuel's hand traced lazy patterns on her bare back, and Grace shivered at the intimacy of it all. "Good morning, wife," Samuel rumbled, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, husband," Grace replied, feeling the words settle over her like a warm blanket. They lay together in comfortable silence, neither wanting to move and break the spell. Finally, Samuel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I should get up and tend the animals. They're probably wondering what happened to their breakfast." "They can wait a few more minutes," Grace said, tightening her arms around him. "I'm not ready to let you go yet." Samuel chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest. "Greedy woman, but I like that about you." He shifted slightly, rolling onto his side so he could look at her properly. "Are you all right?" "I tried to be gentle, but I know last night was—" "Perfect," Grace interrupted, reaching up to touch his face. "Last night was perfect. You were perfect. Stop worrying." Relief washed across Samuel's features, and he kissed her tenderly. "I just want you to be happy, want to make sure I'm doing right by you." "You are," Grace assured him, "more than you know." Eventually, they had to leave the warm cocoon of the bed. Samuel dressed and headed out to tend the animals while Grace washed and changed, her body feeling different in ways she was still processing. She made breakfast with a smile she could not suppress, feeling utterly transformed from the desperate woman Henderson had turned away weeks ago. As autumn deepened into winter, Grace and Samuel settled into married life with surprising ease. The work was hard and constant, preparing the cabin and supplies for the harsh mountain winter ahead. They split and stacked wood until Grace's arms ached, preserved every scrap of food they could gather, and reinforced the barn and chicken coop against coming storms. But the work never felt burdensome, because they did it together. Samuel taught her constantly, showing her how to read the weather signs and track animals, how to set snares and dress game. Grace, in turn, brought organization and efficiency to the household, her education finding unexpected applications in their mountain life. More than that, they simply enjoyed each other. Samuel proved to have a dry wit that made Grace laugh, and he loved hearing her read aloud in the evenings by firelight. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts and dreaming about their future, and the passion between them showed no signs of fading. If anything, it grew stronger as they learned each other's bodies and desires. One evening in early November, Grace was reading while Samuel carved a new axe handle by the fire. Snow had begun falling that afternoon, the first real storm of the season, and the world beyond their windows had disappeared into swirling white. "Samuel," Grace said, setting down her book, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, his hands stilling on the wood. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Grace assured him, then hesitated. "Actually, I'm more than fine. I'm pregnant." Samuel's eyes went wide, the axe handle clattering to the floor as he surged to his feet. "Pregnant? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor," Grace said. "I've missed my courses, and I've been sick in the mornings for the past week. All the signs point to it." Samuel crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her chair. His large hands came to rest gently on her still flat stomach, his expression one of awe. "A baby," he breathed. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. They had not discussed children, had not planned for this so soon. "Happy?" Samuel looked up at her, and Grace saw tears shining in his pale eyes. "Grace, I'm beyond happy. I never thought I'd have a family of my own, never dared to hope for it. You've given me everything." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, his hands still cradling her belly. Grace felt her own tears spilling over, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. 6 weeks ago, she had been alone in the world. Now she had a husband who loved her and a child growing inside her. "We'll need to be extra careful this winter," Samuel said, already planning. "Make sure you stay warm and get enough to eat. And come spring, before the baby arrives, I'll take you to Seattle to be checked by a proper doctor." "Samuel," Grace laughed through her tears, "I'm pregnant, not made of glass. I can still work." "I know," Samuel said, but his protective instincts were clearly roaring to life. "But I'm going to take care of you anyway. You and our child both." Winter closed around the cabin like a fist, snow piling deep and winds howling through the mountain passes. Grace had feared she might feel trapped or isolated, but instead, she found the forced intimacy wonderful. She and Samuel spent long evenings by the fire, talking and making love and planning for the spring baby. Samuel carved a cradle from pine, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work, while Grace sewed tiny clothes from fabric they had purchased during their last trip to Seattle. The morning sickness passed after the first few weeks, and Grace bloomed with health despite the harsh conditions. Her belly grew round and full, and Samuel seemed endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body. He would rest his hand on her stomach for hours, waiting to feel the baby move, his face lighting with wonder each time he caught a flutter or kick. "Strong already," he would say with pride. "Takes after you." "Or after you," Grace would counter. "Those are definitely your muscles pushing around in there." Christmas came and went quietly, just the two of them exchanging simple gifts. Samuel had made her a beautiful wooden jewelry box carved with intricate forest scenes. Grace gave him a warm sweater she had knitted in secret, working on it whenever he was outside. They celebrated with a special dinner and made love slowly in front of the fire, Grace's rounded belly between them, tangible proof of their love. As winter gradually loosened its grip and early spring began to show itself in melting snow and emerging green shoots, Samuel became increasingly anxious about the coming birth. He wanted to take Grace to Seattle well before the baby was due, but the mountain passes remained treacherous with late-season storms. "We can't wait much longer," he said one evening in late April. watching Grace waddle around the cabin with her hand pressed to her lower back. "What if the baby comes early?" "Then you'll have to deliver it yourself," Grace said practically, though the thought made her nervous too. "Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years, Samuel. We'll manage." But fate intervened in the form of an unusually warm spell that melted the last of the snow. Samuel insisted they leave for Seattle immediately before another storm could trap them. Grace agreed, more for his peace of mind than her own comfort. The ride down the mountain was slow and careful, with Grace seated sideways in front of Samuel, his arms cradling her protectively. They took a room at a different hotel, one that welcomed married couples without question. Samuel found a midwife recommended by the local doctor, an experienced woman named Mrs. Brennan, who examined Grace and declared everything progressing normally. "Baby will come within the next 2 weeks," Mrs. Brennan predicted. "You've done well keeping her healthy through the winter, Mr. Thornton. Your wife is strong." Samuel preened at the praise, and Grace hid a smile at his obvious pride. They settled into the hotel room to wait, Samuel hovering over Grace like a nervous hen. She found his concern endearing even when it became overbearing, touched by how much he cared. Grace went into labor on a warm May afternoon, 10 days after their arrival in Seattle. The pains started slowly, then built with increasing intensity. Samuel fetched Mrs. Brennan, and then paced the hotel room like a caged animal, helpless in the face of his wife's suffering. "Out," Mrs. Brennan ordered firmly. "You're making her nervous with all that pacing. Go downstairs and let me do my work." Samuel looked ready to argue, but Grace managed to gasp, "Go, I'll be fine. Mrs. Brennan knows what she is doing." He kissed her forehead, his face tight with worry, and reluctantly left the room. The labor stretched through the afternoon and into the evening, hard and exhausting, but no worse than Mrs. Brennan had seen many times. Finally, as the sun set over Seattle's harbor, Grace gave one last tremendous push and heard the thin, angry wail of her newborn child. "A boy!" Mrs. Brennan announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Grace's chest. "And a big one, too. Must be 9 pounds at least." Grace stared down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He had a shock of dark hair and his father's determined chin, his tiny fists waving as he announced his displeasure at being born. Grace felt her heart crack open with love so intense it hurt. "Someone fetch the father," Mrs. Brennan said to the hotel maid who had been assisting. "Tell him his wife and son are both healthy." Samuel burst through the door moments later, his face wild with concern. "Grace, are you all right?" "I'm perfect," Grace said, her voice hoarse. "Come meet your son." Samuel approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, his eyes locked on the tiny bundle in Grace's arms. When he finally looked down at his newborn son, his expression transformed into something Grace had never seen before, pure, unfiltered love mixed with awe. "He's so small," Samuel whispered, one finger gently stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "So perfect." "He's enormous," Mrs. Brennan corrected cheerfully. "Biggest baby I have delivered in months. Good thing your wife is strong." Samuel carefully gathered his son into his massive arms, the infant looking impossibly tiny against his father's broad chest. He stood there, rocking gently, tears streaming unchecked down his bearded face, while Grace watched with her own tears flowing freely. "Thank you," Samuel said roughly, looking at her with such love it made Grace's breath catch. "Thank you for this gift, for our son, for everything." "We made him together," Grace said softly. "He's ours, Samuel, our family." They named him Seth, after no one in particular, just a name they both liked. Seth Samuel Thornton, born May 15, 1884, healthy and loud and absolutely perfect. They stayed in Seattle for 2 weeks while Grace recovered her strength, then made the careful journey back to the cabin. Grace had worried that motherhood might be overwhelming, but she found herself taking to it naturally. Seth was a good baby, sleeping and eating well, growing visibly stronger each week. Samuel was utterly besotted, spending hours just watching his son sleep or holding him against his chest while he worked around the cabin. "Never knew I could love anything this much," Samuel admitted one evening, rocking Seth while Grace prepared dinner. "Thought I loved you as much as a man could love, but this little one multiplies it somehow." "I know," Grace agreed, understanding exactly what he meant. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Summer passed in a blur of baby care and cabin maintenance. Grace had feared she might miss her old life, might long for Philadelphia's libraries and culture. But she found herself utterly content in the mountains with her small family. She loved watching Samuel teach Seth about the world in his own way, holding the baby up to see a deer at the edge of the clearing or pointing out hawks circling overhead. As Seth grew from infant to toddler, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news felt less shocking and more like a natural progression. Samuel was delighted, already imagining Seth as a big brother. Grace hoped for a girl this time, though she would be happy with whatever came. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Samuel's lost sister, arrived in early spring. She had Grace's auburn hair and green eyes, with a fierce determination that showed itself from her first moments. Seth, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. Seth learned to walk and talk, following his father everywhere and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Sarah proved to be just as strong-willed as her mother, never backing down from her older brother. Grace and Samuel watched their children grow with pride and wonder, their love for each other deepening with every shared challenge and triumph. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Grace with a new addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom for the children so they could have more privacy. He had been working on it in secret, building the extra room onto the side of the cabin with the same care he had given the original structure. "Samuel, this is wonderful," Grace exclaimed, exploring the new space. "The children will love having their own room." "Figured we could use the space," Samuel said, pulling her close, "especially if we're going to keep having babies." Grace laughed, pressing into his embrace. "Is that your plan? Fill the cabin with children?" "If you are willing," Samuel said seriously. "I never had brothers or sisters I could count on, never had the family I wanted. I'd like our children to have what I didn't." Grace looked up at her husband, this mountain man who had taken a desperate woman into his home and given her everything. He was still as physically imposing as the day they had met, his muscles hewn from years of hard labor, his face weathered by sun and wind. But Grace knew every line and scar, had traced them with her fingers 1,000 times. She knew his gentleness and his strength, his fierce protectiveness and his tender heart. "Then we will have more children," she agreed. "As many as come. This is a good life we have built, Samuel. I want to fill it with love." He kissed her then, deep and passionate despite the sounds of their children playing nearby. "I love you, Grace Thornton. You saved me just as much as I saved you that day in Seattle." "We saved each other," Grace corrected, "and we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." Over the next years, their family grew. Another son, Samuel Jr., arrived 2 years after Sarah, followed by twin girls they named Martha and Margaret. The cabin expanded further, with Samuel adding rooms as needed, and Grace managing the organized chaos of a large family. Seth grew tall and strong like his father, learning to trap and hunt and care for the land. Sarah proved to have her mother's sharp mind, devouring every book Grace could acquire and asking endless questions about the world beyond their mountains. The younger children followed their older siblings' leads, each developing their own personalities and interests. Grace sometimes thought about the woman she had been, standing in the Grand Pacific Hotel and being told she was not good enough. That woman felt like someone from another life entirely. She had become stronger than she ever imagined, capable of things she never would have attempted in Philadelphia. She had delivered 5 children with only a midwife's help, kept a household running through harsh winters, learned to shoot and fish and preserve food, and do 100 other things that refined ladies never considered. But more than the practical skills, she had learned what it meant to truly love someone. To build a life with your partner, sharing burdens and joys equally. To create a family not bound by society's rules, but by genuine care and respect. To find beauty in simple things, a sunrise over the mountains, your husband's rough hands holding yours, the sound of your children's laughter echoing through the trees. On their 10th anniversary, Samuel and Grace left the children in Seth's capable care and rode to their favorite spot, a small meadow an hour from the cabin where wildflowers bloomed in riotous colors every summer. They spread a blanket and lay together under the blue sky, holding hands and watching clouds drift past. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Grace turned to look at him, this man who had given her everything she needed even when she had not known what that was. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a home, Samuel. Not just this cabin, but a real home. A place where I belong, where I am valued for who I am, rather than who society thinks I should be." Samuel rolled onto his side, propping his head on his hand to look down at her. "You gave me the same thing. Before you, this was just a place I lived. You made it a home. You and the children, you are everything I never dared to hope for." Grace reached up to trace the lines of his face, still handsome despite the years and weathering. "We were both lost, I think, alone in our different ways, but we found each other." "Best day of my life," Samuel said seriously. "Seeing you in that hotel, watching Henderson treat you like nothing, made me so angry I couldn't walk away. And then I got to know you and realized you were everything I had been missing without knowing it." "I was terrified," Grace admitted, "coming up to this cabin with a stranger, hoping I had not made a terrible mistake. But from the first moment, it felt right. You felt right." Samuel leaned down to kiss her, slow and deep and full of the passion that had never faded between them. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Here is to the next 10 years, and 10 after that, and however many more we are blessed with." "To our life," Grace agreed, "to our family, to us." They lay together in the meadow until the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, then rode back to the cabin and their waiting children. Seth had managed to keep everyone fed and relatively clean, though the twins had gotten into some mischief that left them covered in mud. Grace cleaned them up while Samuel started dinner, their well-practiced routine unfolding smoothly despite the chaos. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Grace and Samuel sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The summer air was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of the creek. Samuel's arm was around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against his broad chest. "I never told you this," Grace said quietly, "but sometimes I still think about that day, standing in the hotel lobby and feeling like my whole world was ending. I was so lost, so afraid. And then you spoke up and everything changed." "You changed my world too," Samuel rumbled, "made it bigger and better than it ever was before." "Do you think Henderson ever wonders what happened to us?" Grace mused. "If he remembers the unmarried woman he turned away?" Samuel snorted. "Men like Henderson don't remember the people they hurt. They're too busy finding new victims. But I hope he lost business from it, at least." "I hope he learned to be kinder," Grace said, ever the optimist, "though I admit that seems unlikely." "Doesn't matter either way," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "He's part of the past. This is our present, our future. Our children sleeping safely inside, our land thriving around us, our love growing stronger every year. That's what matters." Grace smiled in the darkness, knowing he was absolutely right. The past, with all its pain and uncertainty, had led her here. To this mountain cabin, to this man, to this life she never could have imagined, but now could not imagine living without. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Samuel watched their children grow and thrive. Seth, at 18, was nearly as tall as his father and just as strong, though he had Grace's thoughtful nature. He talked about maybe starting his own homestead one day, or perhaps trying his hand at the timber trade that was growing in the region. Sarah, at 16, had become a beautiful young woman with her mother's determination and her father's courage. She surprised them both by announcing she wanted to be a teacher to help other children learn the way Grace had taught her. Samuel had reservations about his daughter leaving the mountains, but Grace supported Sarah's dreams, understanding that their children had to forge their own paths. The younger children were still finding their ways, but each showed promise in different areas. Samuel Jr. loved working with animals and talked about becoming a veterinarian someday. The twins were inseparable and utterly fearless, climbing trees and exploring the forest with the confidence of children raised in wilderness. As Grace approached 40, she found herself pregnant one last time, much to everyone's surprise. This pregnancy was harder than the others, her body older and more tired. Samuel worried constantly, but Grace remained philosophical. If this baby was meant to be born, it would be. If not, They had already been blessed beyond measure. In the end, their youngest son arrived in late autumn, small but healthy, with his mother's red hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, and he completed their family in a way none of them had anticipated. The older children doted on him, and Grace felt a deep sense of peace, as if this child was the final piece of a puzzle she had been assembling for years. On a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside and all their children gathered around the fireplace, Grace looked around at her family and felt her heart overflow. Seth was teaching Thomas to stack blocks while Sarah read to the twins. Samuel Jr. was helping Samuel repair a broken chair, their dark heads bent close together over the work. Samuel caught her looking and met her eyes across the room. The love in his gaze was as strong as it had been 15 years ago when he had first kissed her in this cabin. He mouthed the words, "I love you," and Grace felt tears prickling her eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude for this life they had built together. Later, after the children were asleep and she and Samuel lay together in their bed, Grace whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." "For what?" Samuel murmured, his arm tightening around her. "For seeing me that day, for speaking up when no one else would, for giving me this life, this family, this love, for everything." Samuel rolled to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You gave me just as much, Grace, more even. You took a lonely mountain man and made him part of something bigger than himself. You gave me purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me a reason to build instead of just exist." "We gave each other everything," Grace said softly. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every hardship, every challenge, every moment that brought us here. I would choose you every single time." Samuel kissed her tenderly, and they held each other in the darkness, two people who had found salvation in each other when the world had turned its back. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain home in white silence. Inside, the fire banked low, casting gentle light over the cabin that had sheltered their love and watched their family grow. Years later, when Grace and Samuel were old and gray, they would sit on this same porch and watch their grandchildren play in the clearing. Seth had indeed started his own homestead nearby, bringing his wife and children to visit often. Sarah had gone to Seattle to study teaching, then returned to open a small school in one of the growing towns, where she taught children of all backgrounds without discrimination. Samuel Jr. had become known throughout the region as someone who could heal any sick animal, his gentle touch inherited from his father. The twins had married brothers from a neighboring family and lived close enough to visit regularly. And Thomas, their youngest, had stayed at the cabin to help his aging parents and learn his father's trade. But that was still to come. On this winter night in 1899, Grace and Samuel simply held each other and counted their blessings. The woman who had been denied service at the Grand Pacific Hotel no longer existed. In her place was Grace Thornton, wife and mother, mountain woman, survivor, beloved. She had found her home in the most unlikely place, with the most unexpected man, and built a life richer than anything she could have planned. Samuel had promised to take her to his cabin and give her better than what the hotel offered. He had kept that promise beyond her wildest imaginings, giving her not just shelter, but love, not just protection, but partnership, not just a house, but a true home. And Grace had given him the same in return, two lost souls finding their way together in the wilderness and creating something beautiful from their shared determination to survive and thrive. As they finally drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Grace's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. She had gambled everything on a stranger's kindness and won more than she ever dared to dream. Love had found her when she was at her lowest, and it had lifted her higher than she ever thought possible. In the mountains of Washington Territory, in a cabin built by determined hands and filled with love and laughter, the Thornton family slept peacefully. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in pristine white, a blank canvas on which new stories would be written. But inside, the story was complete, a tale of two people who saved each other and built a legacy that would endure for generations. The mountain man had seen her being denied service at the hotel. He had taken her to his cabin and given her something infinitely better than what she had been seeking. He had given her love, family, purpose, and a life worth living. And she had given him the same in return. It was enough. It was everything. It was their happily ever after, earned through courage and hardship and unwavering devotion. And in the years to come, their children and grandchildren would tell the story of how Grace and Samuel found each other, a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures and that true love can bloom in the most unexpected places. The end.